Welcome. I'm Michael Bickert. Thanks for joining me today as we explore concepts with the objective of improving your management skills and growing your business. Pause the video right now so that you can grab a notepad and a pen, because I want you to jot down something in our discussion today that you can take away and implement in your business today. It's all about action items and implementation. The topic I wanted to discuss today is deriving strength through humility. And I recorded a video a little while ago in which I alluded to being able to learn from all different sources and being a student and finding inspiration in a variety of different situations and people, always looking to learn and to grow. And in that video, I alluded to a previous employer I had many years ago who was not particularly inspirational. I found out later that he had a pretty poor moral compass. And I used him as an example that even in people that would, you would ordinarily think this is not a person I want to learn from, you could still learn something. And I used him as an example that I did learn something from. And that was, I shared an anecdote in that video where with that company, we had brought in a business guru, this consultant from New York, to come and evaluate a startup business that we were operating. And before we picked him up at the airport, the person to whom I'm alluding said to me, "Be humble. In our meetings, exercise a great deal of humility." And I won't elaborate on all that he said, but I will tell you this, that humility has not been my strong suit throughout my life. On the contrary, I've relied heavily on pride. I've been really ego-driven. And according to the Christian tradition, humility is a virtue, and it's one that offsets or opposes the cardinal sin of pride. And so, you know, I shouldn't boast about having such a great deal of pride throughout my career and a bunch of ego. In fact, I should sort of say with humility, I suppose, that I lacked humility. And so this was something I really needed to learn from and have experienced over the years, and want to share with you if you don't realize how powerful humility can be in terms of improving your management and your effectiveness as a business person. So humility is something that you want to make sure that it's genuine, and you can't really force yourself to be humble. That is to say that humility isn't necessarily a way of acting, rather it's an underlying belief and understanding. Humility is derived from an acceptance, according to the Christian tradition, that all goodness comes from God. And so anything over which you would otherwise exude a great deal of pride, you would recognize, well, all that goodness actually came from God. So I shouldn't have pride about that. Instead, I should be humble, realizing that those are gifts that I have. And in that sense, I want to be clear that there needn't be any sort of dichotomy between humility and confidence. I would advise you, when appropriate, to have a great deal of confidence. And even if you're an atheist, even if you don't accept the Christian premise that all goodness comes from God and that all of the things that you would otherwise be quote unquote proud of are gifts to you, think about it from a non-Christian perspective or an atheistic perspective. You either have things inherently, like it was just sort of you were born with something, in which case, what pride is there in that? In other words, if you were just naturally very, very tall and you were able to perform things better that tall people can perform better, or you were naturally, you know, very good looking or whatever, and you didn't have, how could you take pride in that, is what I'm saying, that you didn't do anything to achieve that? Or The other part of it would be you would have to acknowledge that if it was something that you developed, that you developed that with the assistance of others. There's scarcely anything I can think of that we develop on our own. When we improve ourselves, it's typically through the application of advice and guidance of our peers, our parents, other people that influence us. And so no matter which way you look at it, whether these things are gifts from God that you rely on, or they are things that you're just naturally born with, or you develop them with the assistance of others, regardless of your paradigm regarding where your greatest strengths are derived from, I think we can all agree that humility is due because you can't take sole credit for those things which are most advantageous to you. And with that in mind, I would repeat the idea that there needn't be any sort of dichotomy between confidence and humility. You can be humble and confident in the same situation because it's an underlying understanding of the facts. So you can be confident that factually you may have a great deal of information, you may have a great deal of expertise and skill in a particular area, and you can be confident of that and its ability to assist you in the situation. And yet you can still be humble, realizing that you can't take sole credit for the possession of those traits or characteristics. Now, how does this apply in business, and how did it apply going all those years back to that anecdote I told and since then? When you are interacting with others, that humility will serve you well insofar as you use it to strengthen your position of knowledge and create an environment in which others can shine, and you'll benefit from that. And so in a meeting where you consider the opposite, in a meeting, if you had a great deal of pride, you think of yourself as the smartest guy in the room, and you are perceiving yourself to be the expert, and then you sort of show up and throw up and share with everybody how much you know and everything. What have you gained from that? I would argue that the others in the room may have gained something from listening to you. They may have gained some of your expertise and some knowledge from that, but what have you gained? Instead, by being humble and listening to what others have to say and observing what others may contribute, you will learn from that, and then you take away something. So that's an example of you gaining strength in humility. I want to advise you to never go into a meeting, or rather never exit a meeting, having not asked questions that you wish you'd asked or that you should ask out of pride. So that happens a great deal. We've all seen this. We've seen it from the time we were in school, any classroom situation, in meeting situations. It happens all the time. People are afraid of looking stupid, so they fail to ask a question that's important to them or something that's on their mind. And everybody's doing it. And so it may be that a lot of people in the room have the same question, but nobody wants to speak up for fear of looking silly. And that is born of pride. So the humble person who says, I just don't get it. And, you know, there's the famous scene in the Tom Hanks movie Big, where he raises his hand in the R&D meeting and says, I don't get it. Another guy had just done the presentation. I don't get it. In forcing others to clarify the position, you will learn. Now, what you'll find sometimes is that people actually can't back up their position, or what they're explaining, they don't understand very well themselves, or it's logically unsound. And therefore, you have no reason to be shameful of the fact that you don't understand it. You should always speak up. But it doesn't matter what is the reason that you don't understand something. It may be inappropriate based on time or whatever to keep forcing a person to re-explain himself. But I would definitely raise the subject. You never want to misrepresent your comprehension of some particular principle or strategy or what have you that is being explained in a meeting. Instead, have the humility to speak up and ask questions, and then just keep coming back to it. I've learned so much this way. And I think to the chagrin of some people who've been in meetings with me where they might be frustrated. But, we're talking about being effective, you being effective in business. And I have to focus on me being effective in business. And if I come away from a meeting where I relied heavily on pride or didn't rely on pride, but rather I allowed pride to be an obstacle to me, and instead I could have used humility to learn, then I really have no one to blame but myself. So my advice to you is, again, in meetings, it could be one-on-one, in an interaction, any business interaction, including with customers, any other stakeholder, make sure you understand and be humble. Have an underlying acceptance that other people have something to offer, and seek first to understand and then be understood. That is very helpful to practice that when you come from a place of humility as well. I recall a situation early in my management career when I asked a question of somebody who was administrative personnel and was, lower level on the chain of command, so to speak, more frontline staff. And I asked a question of this gal, and she said, "Well, I don't know, you're the manager." And I sort of, tail between my legs, accepted that premise and went away and thought, I guess I should know that. And that's what I'm talking about here. That's pride. That's pride that made me go away. Instead, I should have, admitted, yeah, but I don't know. I'm new to this. And could you help me? I should have been humble in the situation and admitted that. And any time that I find myself in a situation where that pride makes me think that I should be, even though I'm not particularly competent in an area, that's an area of weakness. The strength will come from the humility, admitting that you don't have the strength. When you consider the outcome of these situations, if you are not particularly skilled or you don't particularly grasp a concept that's being discussed, and your pride makes you feign that you do, you're going to have substandard results. Instead, use humility and continue to try to get that information, gain help and input from others. You will find that people very commonly want to assist. They want to share their information. They're delighted to do so. Another thing I've seen in management and people that I've worked with is that they, sort of just like the anecdote I just shared, but more related to HR, that people are afraid of maybe working with and hiring someone who's got a great deal more experience, expertise, or intellect than they do, than the individual who's doing the hiring does. And I think that's the exact opposite. You always want to try to hire people that are better than you. Have humility and realize you have your limitations. And from an HR perspective, you want to try to offset your weaknesses through a strategic acquisition of a particular talent, expertise, and intellect. And so I've heard comments, a variety of comments, that lead me to conclude that a person has this paradigm that they should somehow be smarter than their employees. Well, you're not going to get very far in business if you want to ensure that you're always the best. I like to say that make sure that your people make you look good, not by comparison, but by actions, meaning that they'll make you look good that you decided to put them on your team. That's what made you the smart one, is that you acquired them for your team. Not by comparison to them do you look superior in any way. And so, again, it comes from a place of humility. And humility is this underlying understanding that you can't take credit for all your strengths. They're not solely because of you, if at all because of you. And so you can still be confident. You still have your strengths, but you recognize that you also have weaknesses. You also have to give credit where credit is due. And in every situation, if you can employ some humility, underlying understanding, a paradigm of humility, as counterintuitive as it may seem, you will actually be in the strength position. And I really feel like this is a difficult one for me to articulate. And unless you've experienced this for yourself, you may not be picking up what I'm trying to communicate here. I just need to really emphasize that I see it time and again. And maybe it's one of those things that until you witness it in someone else, you have a hard time doing that introspection and recognizing it in yourself, that we commonly exude weaknesses or put ourselves in a position of weakness by relying on pride, not relying on pride, I keep saying that, but instead allowing pride to be an obstacle. If you can rely on humility, if you can approach things from a humble point of view, then you put yourself in this position of strength, because you will get others to help you and give you more input. And that's where you gain effectiveness. That's where you gain knowledge. That's where you improve yourself. And that's the name of the game. I'm not advising you to act humble or give the illusion of humility, to put on some kind of air. Instead, exercise humility with an understanding that it's in your own self-interest to do so. That when appropriate, it's better to be the student than the teacher. Now, don't, exercise any kind of false modesty. You still know where your strengths lay. But the underlying premise here is that you don't want to allow your pride to be an obstacle and end up in business situations in which you're coming away with a lack of clarity, a lack of understanding, and a weak position because you were afraid to admit you didn't understand something, you couldn't accept something, and somebody could have probably helped you with that if you had only taken the time to ask, and it takes some humility to do that. Lastly, there's also this concept in business that coming across with a great deal of arrogance to your stakeholders and with people with whom you communicate can definitely be a liability, obviously, as well. You've all dealt with somebody who just came across with such a big head and so much ego that it turned you off, and it was a liability to that person in trying to influence you and communicate with you. And so exercising humility, again, genuine humility, not a false sense of modesty and not feigning anything, will serve you well in that regard. For whatever reason, this has been a concept that I feel has been difficult for me to communicate today. And that could be, as I mentioned at the beginning, because I haven't had a great deal of humility throughout my life. I've had so much pride and everything, and I've struggled with this one myself. And so maybe I'm the last person who should be preaching on this subject or trying to teach anybody on it. And yet, I've experienced so much in the way of benefits by having this realization that I wanted to communicate this to you. And that's what I do with these things, is I try to think, what have I learned and what would somebody else out there maybe benefit from my experience, and maybe they haven't learned this yet, or they haven't seen this, or they haven't really taken time to reflect on it. And I want to share that with you. So I apologize if it was a little incoherent and the way that I delivered the information wasn't as cogent as it otherwise could have been. But in summary, I would just say to you that, number one, try to exercise humility, genuine humility, with the underlying premise that your greatest strengths are not because of you. You either inherently have them or they're God-given gifts, depending on whether your paradigm and your theology, or you've developed these with the assistance of others. Therefore, you should have some humility, understanding that you can't take credit for all that is great about you. And secondly, that when you go into any kind of business situation and communication, exercising that humility will give you the upper hand and strengthen you, because you will come away with more than you otherwise would. Thirdly, you won't have to worry about suffering the liabilities of coming across as arrogant and turning people off. And then the last one is make sure that you understand that there's no dichotomy between your confidence in what your true strengths are and where they lay, and understanding humility and exercising humility. So that's where we're going to leave it today. I really would like you to make some comments and have other people benefit from how you would phrase this. What have you experienced in terms of the liabilities of pride and arrogance, and where the assets of the virtue of humility have come to fruition in your business or in your personal life, and in any way that it's made you more effective. I'm interested in hearing from you. We've got to learn from one another. Perpetual refinement.